Hi, welcome to the lecture on historical context of couples, mostly, and families. This marks the first lecture in our unit on context in HDFS 402. It's a short unit with just 3 lectures, this one, then sexual orientation and gender identity, and then race, ethnicity, and social class. Okay, so with the start of this unit, we also begin our additional required readings. And so for each of the required readings, I posted questions to consider on Canvas, which often guide you to what you might need to know about the reading for the exam. If you can answer the questions to consider, then you can usually answer the questions on the exam. And also, these are optional for you to discuss for your reading discussions. Okay, so we'll be getting into this more, but Kuntz has done a lot on the history of marriage, wrote a book on that topic. And so, yes, it's fascinating to think about kind of how has society changed in its historical shift of marrying for love? You know, what did we used to marry for? How does marrying for love actually unintentionally lead us to divorce? And you might just reflect on what you think the meaning of marriage is today or should be. This PowerPoint is divided into 2 sections. First, we'll be talking about the family decline versus the family transformation perspective that includes some historical context on family. And then we'll be going more specifically into the historical view of marriage in the United States. As we progress through this PowerPoint, and you also do the readings by Stephanie Kuntz, I encourage you to ask yourself, is the family getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it some of both? This graph just shows changes between 2010 and 2019 to the answer to the question, does the growing variety in the types of family arrangements that people live in, is it a bad thing, a good thing, and it makes no difference? And what you can see that we've got more people where we were fairly kind of evenly split in 2010, with a third saying makes no difference, a third saying good thing, a third saying bad thing. Now you can see that we have about the same number of people saying it's a good thing, but we have an increased number of people saying it makes no difference, living arrangements, and less people saying that it's a bad thing. So you can kind of think where you would fit in this poll. So we're going to be talking about these 2 perspectives on the family. The first one is the family decline perspective, which basically says what's best for society is the SNAF, a heterosexual nuclear family with the woman taking primary responsibility for young children. And because we have less of these right now, that means that the family is in jeopardy in our society. The family transformation perspective is more neutral, and it says that the family is changing, it's transforming, and sometimes that is for the better. The family decline perspective was best articulated by David Popenoe in kind of family sociology journals in the 1990s. And the family transformation perspective has really been represented by Stephanie Kuntz, who we're going to hear quite a bit from. I would say in recent decades, family studies has really just focused on the family transformation perspective, not family decline, which probably dominated maybe more in the 1980s and 90s and all this writing about children from broken homes and divorce and things like that. So you'll notice that you have readings on the family transformation perspective, but not really on family decline since it's not so current anymore. But still, I think these 2 perspectives, even though family transformation is still mostly represented in the academic literature, in our general society, I think we could maybe see both of these perspectives. So a little bit more about the family decline perspective. So it would say that society is declining, we're going downhill because we have a decrease in nuclear families, or the SNAF, and this is due to our higher rates of divorce, single motherhood, cohabitation, people not having kids or not getting married, women working and not taking primary responsibility for kids, same-sex couples, decreases in religiosity, and increased birth control and legalized abortion, giving people the choice about whether or not to have kids. So supporters of the family decline perspective would cite research on things like working mothers are more likely to divorce. They would say, kids who don't have supervision after school engage in higher rates of delinquency or substance use. They would say that kids who don't have married parents experience disadvantages cognitively, emotionally, socially, more specifically, have higher rates of stress, less stability, and less contact with fathers. The family transformation perspective would not disagree with these findings, but they would disagree with what to do about it. So, whereas family decline would say the answer is marriage and women staying at home with kids, the family transformation perspective would say society is changing and we have to change with it. Working mothers are more likely to divorce. It's not because working destabilizes a happy marriage. It's because working gives them the financial resources to get out of an unhappy marriage. Family transformation would say, unsupervised youth after school do have higher risk behaviors. The answer isn't necessarily a mother staying at home with them, if that's not feasible or desired, but it's us responding and providing more kind of after school supervision, especially for kids in the middle school, kind of early high school ages, and more busing to extracurricular activities and things like that. And then lastly, regarding kind of children without married parents and kind of the disadvantages, family transformation would acknowledge that, but say, the answer isn't necessarily two heterosexual parents, but it is everything that we can do in our society, policies to increase stability and financial security for families and for kids. So Stephanie Coontz is really the foremost family historian in our field, has written a lot of books. I'd recommend them. And so she's the main proponent of the family transformation perspective, although there are others as well. And so what the family transformation perspective would say is that families are adapting to changing social and economic circumstances, and family, quote unquote, is becoming a lot more diverse and complex. Yet at the same time, families haven't ever been as simple or quite so conventional as we like to think, and we'll be getting into more examples of that. And that we tend to have a nostalgia trap about families. It's one of maybe our nice traits as humans that we tend to forget the bad and remember the good. But that can create issues when we're thinking about history. And so in the book that you're reading a chapter from, The Way We Never Were, she talks about a research study that demonstrates the power of nostalgia. And so the research study was done on like fourth graders, you could imagine. And at the beginning in August, when they come back from summer vacation, they're asked to list two lists, one of all the good things about their summer vacation and one about the bad things about their summer vacation. And so hopefully these are all, fairly minor, and they're saying things like, I got to go to the pool, but I got a lot of mosquito bites. I got to see my grandparents, but my brother drove me crazy, right? And so when they first make their list right after their summer, their lists are more like equally long in terms of good and bad. However, if you repeat the exercise like 8 months later in April, as you might imagine, now that this time has passed, the good list ends up being a lot longer than the bad list. And so they're no longer actually describing their summer vacation from the year previous. They've got more this kind of idealized image of the summer vacation. And so it's the same idea with history, that we tend to think about history some of us, not all of us, but in a more idealized way, both personally and in a bigger picture. And we're kind of forgetting kind of all the hard stuff. So let's talk a little bit about the very famous 1950s, which you'll be doing a reading about. And Stephanie Coontz's kind of famous quote, contrary to popular opinion, Leave It to Beaver was not a documentary. So only about half of families in the 1950s met the heterosexual two-parent breadwinner father stay-at-home mother configuration of Leave It to Beaver, and of those, many of them weren't very happy. So here's what Stephanie Coontz and the family transformation perspective would say about the 1950s. First, they would say it's a cultural anomaly. It was a very unusual time in history where we were seeing higher marriage rates, younger ages of getting married, higher birth rates, and greater economic prosperity. It was basically a reaction to the instability of World War I, followed by the Great Depression, followed by World War II. And we as a nation were working really hard to create stability and recover from all of that. And we were in a time of economic prosperity compared to Europe. So the wars had not been fought on our soil. Our factories weren't bombed out. We weren't still rationing after the war. We could create and export to other countries. So we were doing well, relatively speaking. The second perspective there restricted to certain demographics. We have to remember this view of the 1950s was primarily white to middle upper class heterosexual couples. And so much of society couldn't even have that, leave it to Beaver, even if they wanted to. Marital stability was high, which is staying together, but marital satisfaction wasn't necessarily high. So being happy with your situation. And related to that, the 1950s was a time when we saw dramatic increases in women for rates of mental illness, especially anxiety and depression, or women being labeled mentally ill, like with housewife syndrome, because they weren't happy staying at home. And so with that, we saw increased use of tranquilizers like Valium to cope and alcohol. Okay, so what would the family transformation perspective say about just American history in general, not just the 1950s specifically? So first, it would say that marriages didn't used to last as long in the past as they do now, which seems surprising, but that's because of higher death rates. So maybe you didn't totally love your partner, but one of you is probably going to die in your 30s, or early 40s, and then in childbirth or in a farming accident, and then you could be with somebody else. It wasn't until the late 1970s, actually, that marriages became more likely to end due to divorce than death. So we just had much higher death rates of both adults and children. So, for example, in the 1900s, about half of all parents would have experienced the death of a child. Half of all children 15 or younger would have experienced the death of a parent or a sibling. A quarter of kids would have experienced the loss of one parent. Those are high numbers. So what this means is there was basically constant disruption in the good old days. And children were much more likely than compared to now to live in single parent homes or not with either biological parent, or to have both parents die and to be an orphan and live in an institution or an orphanage, which we really don't have that many of in the United States. So just for example, my grandfather, he was living through the Great Depression, and his mom died giving birth to his little sister, and his dad sent this baby, this new infant, to his mother's sister, and when he remarried, then he felt like he could take care of her, and he had her come back. But this was 4 years later. So this baby lived with extended family for 4 years. And when she returned, it was to a family as a 4-year-old, she had never known or even been with before, which was very traumatic for her. There were higher rates of child maltreatment and intimate partner violence, especially during stressful times like the Great Depression. We also have in our history very high rates of child labor, slave kids, kids working in factories. So as Stephanie Kuntz writes, by around 1820 in northern factories, half of the workers in many factories were boys and girls who were elementary school aged, who hadn't reached their 11th birthday yet. And she paints this picture of just little half-clothed children, trundling down the street to textile mills, in the pre-dawn light, essentially. Further, she writes, for every 19th century middle-class family that protected its wife and child within the family circle, there was an Irish or a German girl scrubbing the floors in that middle-class home, a Welsh boy mining coal to keep the home-baked goodies warm, a black girl doing the family laundry, a black mother and child picking cotton to be made into clothes for the family, and a Jewish or Italian daughter in a sweatshop making ladies' dresses or artificial flowers for the family to purchase. So it wasn't all, lovely for so many people. The last bullet point here is just that divorce can be good for women. And we're going to be getting more into no-fault divorce laws. But what researchers have found is that as states passed no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s, it basically gave women a credible, an ability to leave a marriage. And many women didn't leave the marriage, but just the fact that they could, that their husbands knew that they could easily get a divorce, not easily, but they could get a divorce and walk out. It had effects on husbands' behavior. Domestic violence fell by about a third. The number of women murdered by their partners fell by 10%, and female suicide also fell. So even though we think of something like divorce as something bad, we have to remember that in the bigger context, it can have some positive ramifications. So I'd encourage you to just think about what your view is. Even though the family studies field might be more on the family transformation side, you might not be. You might be more on the family decline side, or you might have some mixed feelings. I think this family decline versus family transformation perspective can be translated to college students, into two perspectives about students. And I think about this when I'm talking with my colleagues and maybe somebody's doing the like kids these days kind of thing. They're not as good as we used to be, right? And so that's more of the student decline perspective, that students are somehow less competent writers than we used to be. They're less engaged, they're less motivated. And I think this sets up more of an adversarial student-teacher relationship. Whereas the student transformation perspective would say, students these days are more diverse than ever, and that's a good thing. Students are changing, our technology is changing, and sometimes that's for the better. That we can so easily fall into a nostalgia trap. As Stephen Mintz says in his quote, for more than 3 centuries, Americans have feared that the younger generation is going to hell in a handbasket. So we are likely misremembering how great we were as students, and we have to remind ourselves that our professors and teachers back then were bemoaning, how terrible we were, essentially. This would also remind professors and teachers that students have a lot to teach us, and we're all on the same side. So it's really worth watching some of Steven Pinker's TED Talk, Is the World Getting Better or Worse? Steven Pinker is famous actually for language development in kids, but he went on to research violence throughout history and wrote a book about it. And what he'll describe some in the PowerPoint is how we've got declines around the world in all of these really difficult violent things. War-related deaths, genocide, murder, slavery, torture, executions, rape, battering, hate crimes, child abuse, intimate partner violence, and animal cruelty. And so even though we have kind of serious problems, of course, that maybe are getting worse, like climate issues, we also have a lot of things that we are improving, and it can be easy to lose that we're improving, and it can be easy to lose sight of that, particularly if we're upset about our current political climate, depending upon our political views. And so I would ask you to kind of reflect on, what are you going to say the next time someone's like, the world's getting worse? And sometimes this comes up with my friends when we're out to dinner, like, and how things are terrible now, and we should go back to a simpler time. And I always kind of challenge them on that. I'm like, what year do you want to go back to? And I learned that from Stephanie Coons, like, what year? Let's name the year. And then let's talk about what are you giving up? Okay, so you're going back to paper maps, are you? You're going back to you can't look up the answer to anything on the internet. You're going back to higher rates of sexual assault and sexual abuse and sexual harassment and intimate partner violence and child maltreatment, and nobody's talking about those things. I'm like, are we really going back to all of that? So I think important to have kind of a balanced view. I show this ad from 1952 just to point out how our tolerance for gender violence has declined. If a coffee company used that these days, their coffee would be boycotted. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears and talk more about the historical perspective of marriage in the United States. Before I get into kind of changing perspectives on marriage, I just want to remind us that we had really diverse contexts for families in the United States that, were the context for marriages. Here's just three of them, but we could imagine that there's lots of other contexts, from all the different immigrant groups that came to the United States, whether that was Chinese or Irish or Japanese or Jewish or German, and they all experienced kind of different forms of discrimination or kind of, challenges. So if we just pick kind of three of the earliest groups in the United States, Native American societies had this context where they were organized by family ties, governed by village elders, which could include women. Some tribes were nomadic, some tribes were semi-permanent, some stayed in one place and were more permanent, and yet they did not believe that land could be permanently owned, which led to some real misunderstandings with white settlers who, when the tribe said, yes, you can stay here, the white settlers thought they could own it forever. There was, as you probably know, a great history of involuntary separation for Native American families where Anglo-Americans wanted to civilize Native Americans, and so they took their children and put them in either foster care or institutions. There were 400 boarding schools across the United States between 1820 up until 1970 for Native American children. Then we have the European American colonists coming, who came with kind of this, idea of a state government, colony government, and boundaries and territories, and we own this. They had, compared to Native Americans, much greater disparities in personal wealth, although some Native tribes had greater differences in social status too, so already that kind of greater income gap. Generally more agrarian or farming, property owning, right, male-headed families. Yet family separation, while not involuntary for many of them, was also common. Sending your kids off to be servants to help support the family, or apprentices, or having them stay with other families if you were unable to care for them, for example, due to death, or a death of a mother, for example. And then we have the African American context, which was very different from the European American, because they were coming here as slaves, coming where they suffered enormous losses, just to mention a few: the language, the religion, your home, experiencing the trauma and brutality of slavery, all of the involuntary family separation from the time they got on a boat to when they were here and being sold and resold. No legal rights to property or marriage. And so forming these kind of sense of kinship society and adoptive kin and godparents, because you didn't always get to have your biological kin. So we're just kind of thinking, reminding ourselves, we're going to talk about some kind of more simple versions of how marriage changed in the United States, but it's going to really depend upon which context you were living in. So this is just a chance to watch this optional video from Stephanie Coons, just a few minutes of her talking about kind of some of her research on the history of marriage. It's taken from her book, Marriage, A History. You should know that the video is from 2010. I couldn't find anything more recent that was on this topic. And so this is prior to the legalization of same-sex marriage, but her book was actually cited by Supreme Court Justice Kennedy in the 2015 SCOTUS ruling legalizing same-sex marriage. And he cited her ideas that there actually has been no one form of traditional marriage, that we are now like blowing apart with same-sex marriage, because marriage has always changed over time. So as you listen to it, you can listen for that theme, and then maybe something that you want to take away and remember to tell somebody else that was interesting. So several scholars have suggested that we've had kind of these three periods in American history in which the meaning of marriage has kind of changed over time. So we've got institutional marriage, first, from like the end of the American Revolution until right around close to the end of the Civil War. Then we've got the companionate breadwinner homemaker marriage, which was from around the time of the end of the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution in the United States, up through the 1960s. And then we have our third and most recent kind of iteration of marriage, the self-expressive or individualistic marriage, from the mid-1960s to present. And of course, it'd be nice if we had these just really clear categories that everybody fit into. But we have to remember that that's not how people work. And so we have all forms of these marriages existing today. And maybe even in the 1920s, we had some people that were pursuing kind of more of a self-expressive, individualistic marriage. I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail in the upcoming slides. So let's start with the first time period for marriage from post-American Revolution until 1850, right around during the Civil War, right around the start of the Industrial Revolution. This is called institutional marriage. And if we made some kind of broad strokes here about maybe predominantly Euro-American families in the United States, we would say it was a farming or agrarian family that was working together. That they were really working together to have food, to have housing, that marriage was about safety and survival and social status and the accumulation of wealth, if you could, but not so much about love. It was about sacrificing kind of personal happiness for commitment. Marriage was heavily dictated by social traditions and norms. It was very patriarchal. As we know, women had no actual legal identity. They could not own property or vote, and they were considered property of either their fathers or their husbands. And so this idea that, marriage is about commitment and that we have to sacrifice personal happiness, that's not, for not everybody is that a thing of a past, right? So some highly religious couples may still kind of identify with this. And I can hear my dad's voice growing up, like, marriage is about commitment, And in fact, even in 2022, 13% of Americans thought divorce was morally wrong, right? And so even if you're unhappy, you're going to be staying together. So we're talking about this time period, 1776 to 1850, but we have to go, wow, okay, so what if we were a Black American during this time? So this was pre-emancipation, which happened in 1865. And so your experience of marriage and life in general really depended upon whether or not you were free, which was just about 10%, maybe 400,000 of the 4 million Black people in the United States, or enslaved, which was 90% of the Black Americans during this time. Free Black people in some northern states were considered citizens and had the legal right to marry. However, they could not generally marry interracially. That was illegal in most states. New York City was kind of one of the exceptions. Enslaved Black people, often did get married, but their marriages weren't legally recognized, and their marriages were, of course, often disrupted by sales of enslaved persons. Okay, so now we move into the second phase for marriage from 1850 to 1965, what's called the companionate breadwinner homemaker marriage. So let's just remember what else is happening during this time. So former enslaved people were legally allowed to marry in 1865, and many did rush to have their marriages legalized. Married women earned the right to own property in 1900. Women earned the right to vote in 1918. Yet we were still, for most couples, falling into a very gendered division of labor, which we've talked about, kind of that separate spheres ideology. It was patriarchal, and this idea that you had kind of your own roles, very distinct roles that you were mutually dependent upon each other with, again, men being more responsible for the public sphere, the world outside of the home, and women being more responsible for the private sphere, the sphere inside the home. However, again, that was more for Anglo-Euro-American privileged couples, and Black and immigrant couples were definitely more likely to be dual career. There was this growing emphasis on love, marrying for love, and the primacy of the husband and wife relationship. So in the late 1800s, it was really common to have emotionally intense ties to siblings, your sister, to parents, to your friends, both for men and women, these kind of passionate connections, more so than your spouse. But in around the 1920s, we began to kind of put the primacy of the husband-wife relationship up there and have higher expectations for marriage. And of course, as Stephanie Kuntz says, once we marry for love, then if love isn't there, we can divorce. And so, ironically, love became the downfall of marriage. Even though we're saying that this, this phase ended around 1965, there's currently many two-parent families that might kind of choose this separate spheres ideology because it's what they need to do to survive and create some stability, even if maybe that's not so personally fulfilling. I don't necessarily want to stay home with the kids, but I think that's for the best. Or I don't necessarily want to work full-time, but I know that I can earn the most, and that's what I need to do right now. So this third phase of the meaning of marriage happened from around the mid-1960s to the present, and it's called the self-expressive or individualistic marriage. So if you could think back to our What is a Theory lecture, it's congruent with the postmodern movement, that whole kind of questioning authority, questioning, does everybody have to follow the rules? Does everybody have to get married? This has also been referred to as the deinstitutionalization of marriage, which basically means less societal control over the marriage rules, or loosening the marriage rules. And so we see that with interracial marriage being legal in all states as of 1969. Same-sex marriage was legalized in 2015. Divorce is considered more acceptable. Also within this self-expressive individualistic marriage, love has become even more tied to marriage today. And we are thinking maybe of marriage more as about a source of personal fulfillment than maybe something we have to do, or something because society wants us to, or we have to do it for survival. So it's this kind of individualistic view of marriage. And I think about this as similar to how our views around work have shifted too, that some of us, maybe if we have the privilege to, aren't necessarily just working to survive. We do have to earn money, but we're also hoping that our work can be a source of personal fulfillment, or it's not just what we are expected to do. You should know that even though this is an interesting theoretical idea, the empirical support for this individualistic idea, the research support for it, is a little bit limited. People are, of course, still marrying for lots of reasons, including, for example, financial security or belongingness. In 2014, some marriage researchers put forth this idea of comparing the meaning of marriage to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it ended up being a whole special journal article where, they put forth their theory, Finkel and colleagues, and then a lot of people basically responded and potentially, criticized it. So the basic idea is that, maybe the institutional marriage that we've been talking about from 1700s to 1800s was about safety, meeting your physiological needs, for shelter and food and clothing, and meeting safety needs. And then once we've established that, we can progress to our kind of love and belonging needs, which was more associated with the companionate marriage of the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. And then once we've been able to meet those needs and establish that, maybe then we move on in our marriages to focusing on how marriage, influences our self-esteem or our sense of self-actualization, kind of becoming our best selves. And Finkel and colleagues went on to say that this idea of making marriage a source of self-actualization, kind of taking yourself to a higher plane, is the reason why we have higher rates of divorce, because it's placing unreasonable expectations on marriage. So hopefully you could follow all that. It was a little logically challenging. And then all the criticisms that came in were like, it's an interesting idea, but we don't have any research evidence that says people are using marriage for self-actualization more now than in the past. Maybe they were doing this, in their own way 100 years ago. Perhaps self-actualization isn't this separate thing you're doing, in yourself, but it's part of how you emotionally engage with someone, a partner, for example. Perhaps we are doing all of these things all the time. We're not just doing them hierarchically. It's not like, okay, I've established my safety and my survival needs, and now I'm going to focus on love. Okay, and then I'm going to focus on my own personal self-esteem, and then I'm going to focus on kind of taking it to the next level. And then the last point is that, we're going to get into this more when we talk about marriage and divorce, that the marriage crisis we see in low-income couples, it's about financial stress. It's not about self-actualization so much. So it's been suggested, maybe self-actualization isn't the best explanation for kind of higher rates of divorce. But we will have to see. It is kind of an interesting idea, this idea that we're placing too much pressure on marriage. And we're going to actually circle back to that when we talk about marriage in a few modules. Okay, so you might pause and think, what's your view of marriage? Do you think of it more about kind of commitment and survival, financial security? Do you think of it more about kind of love, and we each have the things that we bring, our separate spheres? Do you think of it more about self-expressive, kind of individualistic marriage? It's about love, but it's also about personal fulfillment, or some kind of mix? Hey, we've come to the end of the road. Great job hanging in there till the end.